The map of South Africa lies. It lies from the first borderline to the last. It lies when it's painted a single color in school atlases. And it lies every time someone says, "I'm South African," as if that word meant something concrete. Because within those borders, there isn't one nation, there are 11, and for decades they've regarded each other with suspicion, competing for land, for power, and for deciding who has the greatest right to call themselves the true South African. Before South Africa existed, there were the Zulus, the Xhosa, the Afrikaners, the Sotho, the Tswana, the Venda, the Tsonga, the Ndebele, the Swazi, the White British, and the Coloureds. And none of them asked to share a country with the others. The key to understanding South Africa is to assume from the outset that apartheid didn't invent the country's divisions. This is important because the official narrative, the one told in well-intentioned documentaries and anniversary speeches, implies that before 1948 everything was harmonious and that a handful of racist whites arrived and shattered that harmony. The reality is far less heroic. The divisions were already there, they had been there for centuries, and what apartheid did was seize them, freeze them, and cram them into a bureaucratic system so meticulous that it ended up corrupting everything it touched. The architects of the regime didn't invent the rivalry between Zulus and Xhosa. They didn't invent the contempt the Afrikaners felt for the British. They didn't invent the isolation of the Venda in the northern mountains. They simply said, okay, since they're already separated, let's officially separate them. Let's give each group a stamped piece of paper and an assigned territory, and let's pretend this is generosity and not condemnation. This is how the Bantustans were born, that ugly word most of the world has forgotten, but which explains almost everything that happens in the country today. They were falsely independent territories where the white regime forcibly confined black people so they could say, with complete seriousness and before the cameras of the UN, that South Africa was a white country surrounded by black neighbors, not a predominantly black country governed by a terrified white minority. The difference seemed rhetorical, but was brutal. The Bantustans had their flags, their cardboard presidents, their hastily composed anthems, and no one in the world recognized them except the South African regime itself, and, in some shameful cases, Israel, when it wanted to annoy someone. Mandela abolished them as soon as he could, erased them from the maps, and formally reintegrated them into the country, but the damage had already been done. An entire generation of Zulus had grown up knowing their home was KwaZulu, the Xhosa, that theirs was Transkei or Ciskei, the Tswana, that theirs was Bophuthatswana, and although the borders disappeared from official maps, they didn't disappear from people's minds. And that's what makes South Africa, 30 years after the end of apartheid, still function like a building where each floor politely dislikes the other 10. The Zulus are the first line of defense, and they make sure no one forgets it. They are the largest group, around 12 million people concentrated mainly in KwaZulu-Natal, and they behave as what they are, the dominant majority in a country where a dominant majority doesn't guarantee governance. Their pride has deep roots in Shaka Zulu and those 19th century wars where their army, organized with a military discipline more reminiscent of Sparta than an African tribal society, humiliated the British at Isandlwana before being crushed at Ulundi. The Zulus never forgot Isandlwana, and anyone who dares to doubt it is confronted with the fact as easily as producing an identity card. They are warriors. They themselves remind you a people of kings, and they still have a true king, the Zulu monarch, who, although he holds no official political power, remains a figure who sways wills, traditional assemblies, and large weddings in KwaZulu-Natal. They speak isiZulu, the most widely spoken African language in the country, eat pop with meat, listen to Maskandi and Kwaito, fill stadiums with war chants on match days, and look at the rest of South Africa with that mixture of patience and self-assurance of those who know they are the largest group but not the most powerful. And that last part stings them. It stings them a lot, because those who have ruled South Africa since 1994 are not them. It's the Xhosa. And here begins the juiciest fight in the entire country, the one that defines South African politics without hardly anyone mentioning it aloud. The Xhosa are fewer in number than the Zulus, about 8 million, and live mainly in the Eastern Cape, in that harsh green land of the Transkei, where the cliffs plunge into the Indian Ocean. They have produced almost the entire black political aristocracy of the country. Mandela was Xhosa. Thabo Mbeki, his successor, was Xhosa. Oliver Tambo, the intellectual father of the ANC, was Xhosa. Steve Biko, the martyr of black consciousness, was Xhosa. Walter Sisulu, Xhosa. The list goes on, and the Zulus know it by heart. Every time a Xhosa opens his mouth at a rally, you can almost hear their teeth clenching in KwaZulu-Natal. The Xhosa speak isiXhosa, a click-based language that the European ear never quite grasps and which requires almost acrobatic linguistic skill. They have a strong intellectual tradition linked to the 19th century Christian missions that produced the first educated elites of southern Africa, and they see themselves as the thinkers of the country. The Zulus may be the warriors, they imply, but the Xhosa are the ones who write the books and sign the constitutions. The rivalry between them isn't just political, it's aesthetic, linguistic, almost gastronomic. When Jacob Zuma, Zulu through and through, became president in 2009, one part of the country welcomed him as a historical correction. Finally, a Zulu. Finally, one of us, while another part, especially the Xhosa establishment of the ANC, saw it as the exact moment the party lost its way. Zuma sang Zulu war songs at his rallies, wore leopard skins at traditional ceremonies, had 4 wives at once, and seemed to have no shame. For the Xhosa intellectuals of the ANC, this was a public disgrace. For the Zulus, he was simply a man who hadn't forgotten his roots. When Cyril Ramaphosa, half Venda and half affluent farmer from the industrial belt, replaced him, the Xhosa breathed a sigh of relief without admitting it, and the Zulus began voting for a new party, MK, which is essentially Zuma's party recycled to strike back. That is South African policy today, and everything else is just details. And since we're on the subject of details, subscribe or like if you're interested in this kind of thing, because without those clicks, the algorithm forgets about smaller channels. Let's keep going. There are still 9 towns to go, and things get weirder the further down the list we go. The Afrikaners are probably the most awkward characters in this whole story, and it's best to present them without embellishment because they bear the symbolic weight of the country on their shoulders. Descendants of Dutch settlers who arrived in the 17th century, mixed with French Huguenots fleeing Catholic persecution and poor German peasants who came to make their fortune in the wrong part of the continent, the Afrikaners invented themselves as a people as soon as they felt far enough from Europe that they no longer needed it. They created their own language, Afrikaans, which is basically simplified Dutch to which they added Malay, Jalana, and Khoi words, and which today sounds like Dutch that spent too much time in the sun. They created their own church, a strict Calvinist one, obsessed with the idea that they were a chosen people in the Old Testament style, led by the hand of God to a promised land called the Veld. They created a mythology of wagons, of the Great March into the interior fleeing the British, and of heroic battles against the Zulus that ended with rivers stained red and promises carved in stone. And then, with all that symbolic apparatus in place, they invented apartheid. That's the part the rest never forget. Apartheid wasn't designed by white British people or the Johannesburg press. It was designed in Afrikaner universities, in Afrikaner parishes, in Afrikaner social gatherings, and it was implemented with the bureaucratic precision that only a culture that believes it possesses the truth can produce. When it all collapsed in 1994, Afrikaners suddenly found themselves a disgraced minority, still owners of much land and many businesses, but without the political power they had taken for granted for a century. Today there are about 3 million of them, living mostly on farms in the Free State and the Karoo in middle class, neighborhoods of Pretoria, in gated communities with electric fences where children still play rugby as if the world hasn't changed, and in strange projects like Orania, that village in the North Karoo where only Afrikaners live, where the local currency bears Verwoerd's face, and where time seems to have stopped sometime in the 1980s before liberation. Orania exists, it functions, it has a school, a town hall, vineyards, and it grows every year. It's probably the most South African thing you can see on a weekend trip, even though the rest of the country prefers to pretend it isn't there. The white British, or English-speaking whites as they call themselves to distinguish themselves, are the other, uncomfortable side of the coin. They are fewer in number than the Afrikaners, around 1.5 million, and have always considered themselves more cosmopolitan, more urban, and more European. They didn't invent apartheid, they'll readily explain if you give them the opportunity. They were liberals, they read the Mail and Guardian, they voted for the Progressive Party when they could, their universities in the Witwatersrand and Cape Town were hotbeds of dissent. All of that is partly true and partly an alibi that British South Africans tell themselves to sleep better. The truth is that they benefited from the system just as much as the Afrikaners. They lived in the same white neighborhoods, they sent their children to the same white schools, and when apartheid fell, they did what they had been doing for a century: looked down on the Afrikaners as if they were solely to blame. Today, British South Africans live mostly in Johannesburg, Durban, and the green suburbs of Cape Town. They speak English with an accent that blends southern England with a touch of the former empire, are cricket and rugby fanatics, and have left the country in waves for Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United Kingdom. Those who remain share with the Afrikaners the uncomfortable fate of being a white minority in a country that is no longer theirs, even though they still keep 2 passports in a drawer just in case. The Southern Sotho make for a fascinating section because they illustrate, like no other, the absurd logic of the colonial map. They speak Sesotho, live in the highlands of Central and Eastern South Africa, and have a twin cousin literally inside South Africa. Lesotho, that independent kingdom shaped like a smudge in the center of the map that seems like a printing error, yet is one of the few countries in the world whose entire territory is surrounded by another country. The Southern Sotho who remained in South Africa look at their cousins in Lesotho with that mixture of tenderness and envy reserved for separated siblings. Lesotho is poor, mountainous, and cold. The men wear traditional Basotho blankets, which are the national symbol, and the economy depends on remittances and exporting merino wool. But at least Lesotho is Lesotho, with its own anthem and king, while the Southern Sotho of the South African Free State are just one more minority among 11. When a Sotho from Maseru crosses paths with a Sotho from Bloemfontein, there is a cordial greeting and an unspoken question. What would have become of us if we hadn't been cut in half? The Northern Sotho, also called Pedi, live in the north and separated from their southern cousins a few centuries ago for reasons no one clearly remembers anymore. They speak Sepedi, which is similar enough to Sesotho to be understood and different enough to spark arguments, and they are concentrated mainly in Limpopo, that hot, agricultural, and dusty northern province where summer is truly summer, and where the rest of South Africa only passes through on their way to Kruger National Park. The Pedi have less political clout than the Southern Sotho, less press coverage, less visibility, and this has generated a certain resentment of being a forgotten younger sibling. When someone mentions Sotho in a South African political discussion, they are almost never thinking of them. And that, in a culture where being named is tantamount to existing, is a slow wound that adds to the others. The Tswana repeat the pattern, albeit with a different geography. Numbering around 4 million, they speak Setswana and live primarily in the northwest province, that dry, sparsely populated strip bordering Botswana. Like the Sotho, they have a free version of themselves living on the other side of the border. Botswana is a small, peaceful country, surprisingly prosperous thanks to diamonds, with a stable democracy that would be a rarity in West Africa, and a veritable miracle in Southern Africa. The South African Tswana look at their cousins in Gaborone with that same uneasy feeling of having a better parallel life right next door, accessible by bus and yet unattainable because passports are passports and maps are maps. The Tswana people of South Africa were confined by apartheid to Botswana, one of the largest and most absurd Bantustans, an entity fragmented into several non-contiguous pieces whose president, Lucas Mangape, ruled for years with a mixture of tropical corruption and farcical authoritarianism until, in 1994, a group of Afrikaner paramilitaries attempted to save the Bantustan with a comic book coup that ended in a televised shootout, with 3 white mercenaries executed on the side of a road while begging for mercy. That image of the last defenders of apartheid dying to save an invented country of Tswana is the perfect metaphor for how that whole project ended. The Venda are the smallest and most mysterious people on the list, barely 1 million people concentrated in the far northeast of the country, in the Soutpansberg Mountains, right on the border with Zimbabwe. They speak Tshivenda, a language unlike almost any other spoken in South Africa, which gives them that aura of an isolated, almost accidental people who arrived from the north centuries ago and entrenched themselves in valleys where no one bothered them. They have a rich mythology of spirits, sacred lakes like Fundudzi, where swimming is forbidden because a white snake lives there, pythons considered messengers of the ancestors, and initiation traditions that have survived Christian missions, apartheid, and urban modernization. When the rest of South Africa speaks of the Venda, it almost always does so with a tone somewhere between respect and condescension, as if they were a living ethnographic museum rather than a nation with a political voice. And the Venda people notice it, of course they notice it, and that's why when one of their own gets to the top, like Cyril Ramaphosa, half Venda on his mother's side, there's a discreet pride that isn't displayed but is noticeable, a feeling that they've finally remembered us, that doesn't need to be said out loud. The Tsonga, also called Shangaan, complete the duo of forgotten peoples. They live in Limpopo and Mpumalanga, speak Xitsonga, number around 2.5 million, and share an origin with the peoples of southern Mozambique, giving them that cross-border identity that African peoples get along so well with, and that Western maps so poorly understand. The Tsonga are famous throughout the rest of South Africa for their music, the Jibelani, those dances with layered skirts that move at almost superhuman speed, and for a cuisine based on mopane, the edible caterpillars that are a gastronomic delicacy for them and a visual trauma for almost everyone else. Eating crispy mopane, fried or dried, is one of those rituals of Tsonga identity that the rest of the country mentions as an exotic anecdote in travel guides, and that the Tsonga themselves reclaim with a touch of mischief when someone makes a face of disgust. If a caterpillar scares you, they're telling you you're not ready for all of South Africa. The Ndebele are probably the most photogenic people in the country, and they know it better than anyone. A relatively small group, numbering around 1 million, they live mainly in Mpumalanga and northern Gauteng, and they possess the strongest visual appeal in all of South Africa thanks to their houses painted with vibrant, geometric patterns. Those murals of white walls with black lines and blocks of red, yellow, blue, and electric green that appear on the covers of National Geographic magazines and in BBC travel reports. The pioneer of the style, Esther Malangu, even painted a BMW for an art collection and became a cultural ambassador that the rest of the country taps into when it needs to showcase its picturesque side to the world. Ndebele women traditionally wear beaded necklaces, copper ankle rings, and geometric blankets, and although the younger generation no longer wears these designs every day, they are reviving them for weddings and major ceremonies with a very clear awareness of what they are teaching. They speak Isindebele, a language closely related to Zulu but with enough character to claim its own identity, and although they have little political influence, culturally they carry far more weight than their numbers would suggest. A very Ndebele contradiction, one might say. The Swazi are the smallest and most compact version of a familiar pattern. They speak Siswati, number barely 1 million in South African territory, live in Mpumalanga, and like the Sotho and Tswana, have their own neighboring kingdom, Eswatini, formerly Swaziland, which changed its name in 2018 because its king, Mzwati III, one of the last absolute monarchs in the world, decided one day that he'd had enough of the confusion with Switzerland. Eswatini is a tiny country with 15 royal wives, annual ceremonies where thousands of young single women dance before the king so he can choose a new one, brutal economic inequality, and one of the highest rates in the world in any health statistic you'd rather not consult. South African Swazis look at Eswatini with that mixture of fascination and relief at not living there, and maintain very strong family ties that constantly cross the border. Swazi weddings are famous throughout South Africa for their scale, their duration, and the amount of cattle that changes hands as a form of lobola, a reverse dowry where the groom pays the bride's family and the price is discussed with the seriousness of a real estate negotiation. And then there's the strangest group of all, the most artificial and at the same time the most South African on the list, the Coloureds. This is the category that apartheid invented to lump together descendants of Malay slaves brought by the Dutch. Khoisan, indigenous survivors of the most brutal cultural genocide in southern Africa, Afro-European mixes of several generations, and basically anyone who didn't fit comfortably into the categories of white, black, or Indian. The label was a bureaucratic insult, a way of saying, we don't know what you are, but we have to label you with something. And yet the group, against all odds, ended up adopting it and giving it a life of its own. Today, the colored number around 5 million. They are the majority group in Cape Town. They speak Afrikaans, in many cases earlier and better than the white Afrikaners themselves, and they have developed a very distinct culture, with their humor, their Cape Malay gastronomy with boboti and coexisters, their Guima music, their annual Cape Minstrels Carnival in January through the streets of Bo-Kaap, and an identity that is constantly debating between African, Asian, and European without settling completely anywhere. The colored paradox is the most bitter in all of South Africa. Under apartheid, they were treated as second-class citizens, not quite white enough for privilege, but not quite black enough for solidarity. After 1994, they encountered the cruel irony of being too light for affirmative action programs, too dark for traditional white circles, and too Afrikaans-speaking to feel comfortable in the official discourse of the Rainbow Nation, dominated by the Anglophone Xhosa of the ANC. In recent elections, entire sections of the colored community have begun voting for the Democratic Alliance, the successor party to the white liberal opposition, not out of love, but out of distrust of an ANC they feel has forgotten them. Coloureds have been saying for decades that during apartheid they weren't white enough, and now they aren't black enough, and they tell the joke themselves without quite laughing, because beneath the joke lies a real pain of not fitting in anywhere. Indians are the group many forget when making lists, yet they always manage to slip in because Durban is inconceivable without them. They arrived in the 19th century as forced laborers for the sugarcane plantations of KwaZulu-Natal, and when their contracts ended, they decided to stay and establish shops, restaurants, newspapers, and a merchant middle class that produced, among other things, a young lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi, who began developing his philosophy of nonviolent resistance in those streets of Durban before returning to India to apply it on a continental scale. Today they number around 1.5 million, concentrated in KwaZulu-Natal, maintaining Hindu temples, mosques, spice markets whose aroma wafts 3 blocks away, and a cuisine that gave birth to bunny chow, that hollowed-out bread filled with curry that is probably the most South African dish in existence, though no one can quite explain why. Their relationship with the rest of the country has always been tense, with riots against the Zulus in the 1960s, distrust of whites during apartheid that classified them as Asians, and a constant sense of balance between 2 identities that is never fully resolved. And above all, the 11 peoples running through them like an electric current is the central narrative conflict that defines the country and that no South African can ignore, even if they pretend to. The rainbow nation that Mandela sold to the world in 1994. That promise that the 11 peoples could live together under a single flag with 11 official languages and an anthem that blends 4 of them into a single melody never quite materialized. The 11 peoples still vote separately because almost all South African political parties have a clear ethnic base, even if none of them openly admit it. They still live in separate neighborhoods because the urban geography of apartheid doesn't disappear in 30 years, no matter how much the laws change. They still speak separate languages because English is the official lubricant, but the mother tongue is the one spoken at the dinner table. And they continue to compete for the same resources in a country where inequality is the highest in the world according to any index you want to consult, where Johannesburg loses power every few hours, where crime reaches levels that would make Caracas blush, and where corruption, especially during the Zuma years, squandered billions that should have gone to hospitals, schools, and trains. The bitterest irony of all is that this broken promise has begun to produce perverse effects that no one saw coming. When people are angry, when they have gone years without work, without a reliable water supply, without dependable electricity, they look for someone to blame. And the easiest culprits are always those who come from outside. Immigrants from Zimbabwe fleeing first Mugabe's regime and then Mnangagwa's arrived in waves in South Africa seeking the same thing that immigrants all over the world seek, a less miserable life. Mozambicans came for the same reasons, Nigerians for commercial purposes, Somalis to open shops in neighborhoods where no one else wanted to have a shop. And suddenly, in 2008, in 2015, and in 2019, and in constant waves since then, episodes of xenophobia erupted in which mobs of black South Africans attacked other black Africans with a level of violence that left dozens dead, shops burned, and entire families fleeing to makeshift refugee camps. Many black South Africans, the same ones who during apartheid had been victims of a brutal territorial logic, began to defend what was theirs against other black people with that same territorial logic. "This is ours," they said, "not yours." And the phrase, spoken with a Zulu, Xhosa, or Sotho accent, sounded eerily similar to the one that for a century had come from Afrikaner mouths. That is the juiciest irony of the country, and probably the one that best explains why South Africa remains an unstable edifice. Apartheid didn't invent xenophobia. It merely institutionalized it. When apartheid fell, xenophobia didn't disappear. It simply shifted its target. Before, it was whites against blacks. Now it's black South Africans against black foreigners, Zulus against silent Xhosa, Coloureds against Indians in Cape Town, Afrikaners against everyone else in Orania, white Britons packing their bags for Sydney while everyone else stays behind to argue. The system works, paradoxically, thanks to internal conflict. It is conflict that keeps the parties alive. The tribal boundaries useful, the identities sharp, and enough political energy to keep everyone entertained. If the 11 peoples actually got along, there wouldn't be South African politics, there would be administration. And administration, in Southern Africa, has never been entertaining enough to sustain a country. And then you look at the map again, now with 11 colors instead of 1, and you wonder how long this will last. Will South Africa still be one country with one anthem in 50 years, or will the 11 nations each end up going their separate ways, just like what happened in Yugoslavia, just like what happened in the Soviet Union, just like what always happens when someone puts several old peoples on a new map and expects them to like each other? The Zulus will still be Zulus, the Xhosa will still be Xhosa, the Afrikaners will still be painting Orania white, and the Coloureds will still not know where to sit. And the country will still be called South Africa, I suppose, because someone has to name the building even if each floor has its own doorbell.